Does fat cause glycation? Recently, there was an exchange that occurred between NutritionbyVictoria, many people know about, I haven't actually reacted to her on the channel, and Professor Bart K, wherein Victoria said that fat is what causes glycation, and sugar does not. Now, of course, people laughed at this claim and used this as unequivocal proof of Victoria's inanity. However, this brings up an interesting discussion about causality, I think. When I first heard it, this is exactly what I was actually thinking about. And how high of a bar must be reached for an association to be responsibly and truthfully classified as such. Victoria's logic behind saying that fat causes glycation is to do with the Randle cycle, which we've talked about extensively before. I've talked about it in my book, Contrainidicated. Second edition is out now. Link in the description below for hardcover, paperback, and audiobook version, audiobook in my voice. But yes, we've talked about it extensively before. I've talked about it on my channel. Fatty acids and glucose cross-inhibit one another in a cell. And this can therefore cause glucose to pool in the blood when fat is being used in the cell for energy production purposes. So Victoria's logic is that if the cells are oxidizing glucose, pyruvate, the pooling of the glucose in the blood would not happen because the body would be more proficient and adept at using the glucose for ATP production aerobically, thus reducing excess glycation in the bloodstream. Victoria seems to understand that glucose is the compound or the molecule that actually glycates tissues, but that fat itself is what causes the glucose to pool in the blood to cause glycation to occur. Now, in other words, if you're eating glucose, this won't cause glycation unless you're eating lots of fat as well, because that will, push glucose into the blood, leading to glycation. Think of a basin or a sink being filled up with water, and then if you put dishes in the sink, then it could cause the water to overflow if you put enough in there. So there's two solutions. You can remove the water or you can remove the dishes in the sink. That's what is going on here. You could do one or the other to get the glucose, the water, back in and not overflow like that. Now, as much as this is true, it's absolutely the case that even in the context of an absence of dietary fat, carbohydrates can still cause excessive glycation because they're very easily overconsumed. Victoria doesn't seem to understand that glycation will still occur if glucose is consumed beyond what the cells require for ATP production purposes at that given instance in time, before being converted into fat at the level of the liver and adipocytes. Fat is a macronutrient that is quite difficult to overconsume. Of course, any macronutrient can be overconsumed, but it's far more difficult to do this with dietary fat and protein, even with salt, outside of the context of carbohydrates, than vice versa. Victoria admittedly consumes up to 1,000 grams of carbohydrates a day, which is patently beyond what her body requires. Now, this leads into a discussion of how glucose is required in the body in the first place, which is a discussion for another video, so stay tuned for that. So how does this bring up an interesting discussion about the concept of causality? Well, to convey this point, let's think about this question. What causes diabetes? You might be inclined to say carbohydrates, as I often simplify the answer to on my channel. As I often say, you will not find a person who has truly pathological type 2 diabetes that isn't consuming some degree of carbohydrates. However, association does not equal causation. As I also often say in my book and on the channel, people eliminating fat from their diets can see an amelioration of diabetes, and so can people who remove carbohydrates from their diet. This then leads people to say that the real cause of diabetes is insulin resistance, which has many causes. Of course, it's important to understand that insulin resistance itself is not a problem, and is exactly what the body ought to be doing given the circumstances. But what are these circumstances? As we know, there is a phenomenon whereby fat cells reach maximum hypertrophy, or their maximum size, and depending on your specific genotype, your capacity to create new ones, hyperplasia, will be higher or lower, until eventually you've attained your personal fat threshold. And no matter how high the insulin rises, glucose cannot be ushered into the fat cells, thus leading to higher blood glucose levels, thus leading to diabetes. But what causes this? Well, the creation of and storage of fat is often mediated by insulin, and therefore commensurate with the rise in insulin and frequency of insulin secretion is the fat stored. And what is the most conducive way of raising insulin levels to a degree that is most conducive to storing fat? One might be inclined to say consuming carbohydrates, as glucose is the most insulinogenic macronutrient. But this doesn't clearly explain why people cutting fat out of their diets ameliorate their diabetes and their overweight status, which, as we've covered, the latter perhaps having been the cause of the former. The psycho, calories in, calories out folks might be salivating at this point in the video, as this is the perfect opportunity to say that the common denominator here is the calories. As we know, they really mean mass, but even then, this doesn't explain how someone consuming the same amount of mass, if not much more, in the form of no carbohydrates can also lose just as much weight, if not more. So this is clearly not the answer. It seems to be a lowering of insulin, despite the fact that fat is the least insulinogenic macronutrient, and yet was the only one removed in this scenario. But why would this be the case? This all goes back to the Randle cycle for multiple reasons. First of all, fatty acids seem to augment an insulin spike mediated by glucose, according to Philip Randle himself. This can explain the increased fat storage propensity in people consuming mixed macronutrient diets. But additionally, the cross inhibition itself is conducive to storing more fat in both situations. If glucose inhibits fat oxidation, fat pools in the cell and is used to synthesize triglycerides. And if fatty acids are inhibiting, glucose will pool in the blood and cause a higher insulin secretion, thus leading to higher anabolic activity and more substrate to be converted to fat in the first place at the level of the liver and adipocytes. It must be stated here that we are, believe it or not, actually being slightly reductionist here in this elucidation. There are many other factors that could be contributing to fat storage and diabetes, the primary one being the inflammatory status of the body, being influenced by many other dietary factors as well. When someone removes dietary fat, what foods are they removing to do so? What other compounds in those foods could have been the major driving factor for the person's obesity and diabetes? However, we focused on these specific topics because they have the most influence on the body's physiology generally. So what does all this mean? Why did I say all this? Well, it means that the most plausible cause of obesity, diabetes, glycation, is a mixed macronutrient diet, and specifically an upregulation of the Randle cycle status of the body, leading to insulin resistance and obesity. The cause is not carbohydrates nor fat, but rather the mix of both. This is why establishing causality is very interesting, rigorous, and a very arduous process. In the grand scheme of things, though, the application of this, what does all of this mean? Well, you have two options. You can eliminate, fat and keep the carbohydrates in, which still I think is conducive to excessive glycation. Or you can do the opposite. Considering the fact that carbohydrates are the only macronutrient not required for human consumption, well, I think you know where I stand. So, yes, whenever I say in my videos, carbohydrates cause diabetes, it's a simplification to the point of being slightly erroneous. Because if you leave the carbohydrates in but remove the fat, you can also ameliorate diabetes. But here's another important point to add. I read the paper now, okay, because I wrote all this, but now I'm extemporaneously talking about this because I have many other things going on in my head at this moment. What do we mean by diabetes? Who gets to say what diabetes is? Because diabetes, by definition, is chronically elevated blood glucose and nothing else. But what do you mean by elevated? Elevated is based on an arbitrary cutoff, and then you have to ask the question, according to who, on the basis of what? Is it really the case that when you're under the HbA1c line and the fasting blood glucose line that has been arbitrarily decided to be the cutoff for whether you have diabetes or not, does that really mean that you aren't diabetic? Technically, yes. But does it really mean that you're necessarily not exhibiting a problem? As long as it's below that line, it's totally fine? Well, there's no guarantee of that at all. There's no guarantee of that whatsoever. And so when we talk about an amelioration of diabetes, well, it's kind of hard to say according to who, on the basis of what? If you have a fasting blood glucose of 110 milligrams per deciliter, given the context, you may very well be succumbing to excessive glycation. It may not be a deadly level in the grand scheme of things, but so what? And so then it gets into a whole, you're basically doing exactly what I did in my book, Contrainidicated, where you're just tearing down a bunch of edifices, a bunch of constructs. The diabetes diagnosis is a construct. The question, according to who, on the basis of what, is what I ask all the time. And it's precisely for this reason. Really, I think it's a waste of time trying to say, oh, well, what ameliorates diabetes? Well, cutting out fat does it, and cutting out carbohydrates does it too. We shouldn't be. These aren't criteria of health, per se. They're really not. They're all based on arbitrary cutoffs. What matters is, first of all, presentation. But even then, you can present healthily, but also be engaging in contraindicated activities. So you have to, it all goes back to what is indicated in our physiology. It's not about, oh, well, what will ameliorate diabetes? That's the better alternative. Well, diabetes, according to who, on the basis of what? To an arbitrary cutoff? Because then that would mean that I can consume a lot of things that we aren't evolutionarily designed to be consuming, but also be considered healthy. Because first of all, you're considering healthy based on one criterion, which is already a fallacy in and of itself. But that one criterion, you're also characterizing as an on-off switch, like you have it or you don't, based on an arbitrary cutoff. Who gets to decide where the line is drawn in the sand? And so at the end of the day, it's a waste of time. It's bread and circuses. As I also talk about in my book, what matters is determining what is indicated for our physiology and what is not. And that's where we get to the principles of indication, which are based on the evolutionary principles of basically Darwin, the Darwinian principles of evolution. And so then we have hard inferences that we can make in that regard, and those hard inferences are unassailable. They're absolutely unassailable. With that being said, yeah, it's a loaded thing, but I had to touch on this because that was being talked about often. Fat causes glycation. She said fat causes glycation. Yeah, sure, depending on what you mean by that, but also removing the glucose fixes the issue and as well, and also it's the one macronutrient that's not required, and also fat contains vitamins in it and glucose doesn't. I mean, foods with glucose in them can, but then you gotta consider bioavailability, and then you gotta consider what else it's associated with, like fiber and deuterium, blah, 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 blah. I mean, it's just, Anyway, lots to think about. Sit on that for a minute, and yeah. Anyway, if you enjoyed the video, leave a like, subscribe to the channel, leave your thoughts in the comment section below. And also, once again, buy my book, Contrainidicated, if you haven't already. Subscribe to the Patreon if you haven't already to gain access to 1 week early uploads, ad-free content, uncensored content, and an exclusive Discord server. And also, the link on the bottom of the screen that just randomly appeared magically, because I'm magic. What is that link? Well, that is a link that will bring you to an amazing site with amazing products from an amazing brand known as Cerule. If you purchase product through that link, you will get a permanent percentage discount and permanent free shipping when signing up for monthly deliveries. And also, if you email me behind the scenes at edgoki@pm.me, new email, you can learn how to earn those products for free, because who in their right mind wouldn't want that? But of course, I wouldn't want you to buy any product, especially these ones as well, without knowing what they are in the first place. So fortunately for you, I have a video linked in the top right corner of the screen, a Cerule Products video, which is a complete video elucidation and explanation of what those products are, who should take them, why you should take them, when to take them, etc., etc. And I would also further migrate to the description below to find a video between myself and Professor Bart K on these products in further detail, as well as the company of Cerule itself, which I think is incredibly important if you're actually willing to purchase product through the link in the first place. Who are you buying from? Well, we have a video explaining just that. So, with that being said, join me next time when we're basically tackling more inanity, getting philosophical, because, once you really start getting into this stuff, you realize that the foundation of literally everything is philosophical. Everything, including your existence. So, till then.